My name's Alf Nilsson, and I'm the director of CASA. I also work as a professor in the Department of Sociology here at the University of Pretoria. As some of you might already know, CASA is a new initiative at the University of Pretoria, launched late last year, that is intended to work as a key hub of research in the field of Asian studies and the study of Afro-Asian connections in South Africa and on the African continent more generally. CASA is currently in its first year of substantial activity, and much of our current efforts gravitate around building relationships and fostering conversations between scholars in and off the Asian and African continents across research fields related to global challenges such as inequality and human development, democracy and human rights, and sustainability and environmental justice. Now, as many of you who have tuned in today will be aware of, India's countryside is in the throes of a dramatic and continually deepening agrarian crisis. Home to more than 60% of the country's population, rural India has been plagued by a pincer movement in which the costs of cultivation have escalated strongly, while at the same time agricultural incomes have declined or stagnated. This has in turn resulted in increasing levels of indebtedness, which weigh extremely heavily on the shoulders of small and marginal farming households, fueling a suicide crisis among impoverished farmers and agricultural workers. The most recent statistics suggest that there's about 30 suicides a day happening across rural India. You'll also know, of course, that this agrarian crisis animates political contention in India in a significant way. Since Narendra Modi of the BJP took power in 2014, there have been several waves of protests by farmers and agricultural workers, most dramatically, of course, in the form of the protests that, after a year-long struggle, forced the repeal of neoliberal farm laws in late 2021. However, only as recently as yesterday, thousands of farmers and workers gathered in Delhi to protest the economic policies of the BJP government. Now, that's why today we are extremely fortunate to be joined by Dr. Srishti Yadav from Azim Premji University in Bangalore to learn more about the underlying dynamics of this scenario. Srishti teaches economics in the School of Arts and Social Sciences at Azim Premji. She holds a PhD in economics from the New School, New York, and an MA in economics from Jawaharlal Nehru University. Her research focuses on political economy, agrarian change, economic development, and the economics of caste and gender. Through this research, Srishti advances the front lines of critical agrarian studies in India, drawing on insights and perspectives from a rich and extremely venerable tradition that features luminaries such as Utsa Patnaik, T.J. Byers, and others. And she innovates through that work the study of the role of agriculture in India's economy in very crucial ways. In her talk today, she'll draw on an article which she published in the Journal of Agrarian Change in 2022, focusing on how caste and class relations shape the dynamics of accumulation in rural North India. I was just saying before we started to Srishti that I think this is one of the most exciting publications to come out in recent times about India's agrarian questions, and we'll share a link to the piece in the chat box for anyone who wants to check it out. And if you haven't seen it, you really should. It's a great read. We're also very fortunate today to be joined by Seix Latchrael, who will act as our discussant in this webinar. Seix is a PhD candidate in the Human Economy program at the University of Pretoria, and his research and current work areas focuses on agrarian change in South Africa and the state's role in agrarian change from the perspective of the landless poor. He has over 25 years of work experience, primarily in land reform and rural development. Among his other roles, he was the director of the Association for Northern Cape Rural Advancement and the director of the National Land Committee. In these roles, he mobilized for the participation of the landless poor, especially women and youth, in policy making and implementation. He's a former president of the South African NGO and non-governmental organization council and founder member of the Landless People's Movement. He also holds a master's in public management from Regenesis Business School, a postgraduate diploma in agrarian studies from the University of the Western Cape, and a postgraduate diploma in human resource management from Leicester University. Now, housekeeping for our webinars is fairly simple. Srishti will speak for about 40 to 45 minutes, followed by 10 minutes of comments from Seix. After a brief response from Srishti, we'll open up for comments and questions from the audience. You can put these in the chat box, or you can simply turn on the camera and use the mic and speak directly to us. On that note, over to Srishti. We're looking forward to this.
Thank you so much, Alf. I'm just going to share my screen right away. And yeah, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to sort of present my work in this series, which I'm actually extremely looking forward to Zakes's comments, because that's really not something you get to do a lot, is to sort of speak across contexts in a meaningful manner. So let me jump right in. This paper is titled Caste, Diversification and the Contemporary Agrarian Question in India. Very, very sort of tall order, but let me sort of quickly take you through. So I mean, I'll briefly describe the aim of the paper. And instead of spending too much time on what the agrarian question is, I'll move straight into sort of the fieldwork that I did and what I saw and how I try to make sense of it, and then offer something by way of conclusion. So what I'm trying to do in this paper is really to study agrarian change. Agrarian change is important in the Indian context, obviously, because the majority of the Indian population continues to be agricultural. But what that means is changing rapidly, changing in front of our eyes, as Henry Bernstein would say. So what I'm trying to do here is really to look at the social relations of production and agriculture, but recognizing that agricultural households are not just agricultural anymore. They increasingly have a lot of linkages with the non-agricultural sector. I'm trying to place sort of social relations of production alongside, or sort of seriously look at these linkages, so explore diversification of agricultural households, while trying to understand the role of caste in this entire process. So broadly, the theoretical sort of framing is, I'm placing this in the agrarian questions of capital and labor literature, which again is coming sort of from the work of Henry Bernstein, as he tries to sort of rejig the classic agrarian question of T.J. Byers. That original question was, how does agriculture contribute to, you know, the development of capitalism in a nation state? Henry Bernstein makes it into the question of, well, we don't know if the industrialization on the nation state level is happening anymore in the global south. Instead, what we can look at is how the agrarian classes themselves are sort of changing in these really sort of complex ways across region and across contexts. So I try to place myself in this Bernsteinian agrarian question, and through fieldwork that I did in southern Haryana, I try to answer these questions of what are the social relations of production and agriculture. So very briefly, a look at how people have been trying to characterize agrarian classes. I mean, this is an old literature and there's really many ways to do it. One of the most sort of influential tools in this analytical sort of endeavor is the exploitation ratio, the E ratio, that was developed by Utsa Patnaik, which essentially looks at how much labor you're hiring in relative to the family labor that you use. That still happens to be at the core of a lot of the work that's done by, for example, folks over at the Foundation of Agrarian Studies. So the Foundation of Agrarian Studies, this includes people like V.K. Ramachandran, Madhura Swaminathan, Vikas Raval. So they would consider sort of the ownership of means of production, level and composition of the household income, and the labor deployment, the E ratio, on farm and non-farm activities. So that would be sort of one recognized way of trying to understand agrarian classes. Another approach is Jonathan Pattenden's approach, which sort of draws from Henry Bernstein and Jens Lercher, where he focuses primarily on both the E ratio, but also whether surplus is being produced or not. So whether households are surplus producers or deficit producers. And both these sort of set of criteria also yield different, but in some ways similar class structures. What I'm taking, so I'm very heavily drawing on both these sets of literatures, and what I'm going to be looking at is the E ratio within agriculture. I'm going to be looking at the level and composition of incomes within agriculture, the types of diversification that households are engaged in, and the sort of practices of reinvestment, whether surplus is being produced or not in agriculture. So let me also give you a brief introduction to where this field work was located. So I did my fieldwork in a village called Sangli. I mean, this is this is not the real name of the village. So I'm just using the name Sangli because it has, I mean, certain meanings for some of us. But this village is located in district Rewari, which is in southern Haryana. Now, Haryana is in the northern part of India. So this is the northern part of India. These particular states are where green revolution techniques were first introduced from the 70s onwards. These were the sort of most fertile regions with a history of irrigation, where green revolution techniques were introduced. What's interesting about this particular district is that it's in the southern part of Haryana, so it's actually much drier than the core green revolution areas. And that's interesting because it shows some of the difficulties that arise from adopting green revolution techniques in areas where they were not primarily oriented at. So this is a dryland region, which means that water is a big problem. The soil is dry. So the typical green revolution crops, though adopted here, don't perform quite as well as they would in northern Haryana or in Punjab or in western Uttar Pradesh. So that's one reason why this location is interesting. The other is that this is quite close to New Delhi. This is Delhi, the capital. And it actually sort of, from Delhi to Jaipur, runs a industrial belt along National Highway 8, where a lot of international capital has sort of migrated in the last 20-30 years. So this is a lot of Japanese firms, automobile manufacturing, a lot of engineering works. And what that means is that there is industrial development in the area, and Delhi is close by, which is a sort of an attractor of labor from across the country. So there are actual diversification possibilities in this region, which we do see in the village as well. My methodology, I conducted structured interviews with 75 households, and as well as sort of unstructured interviews with elders from various caste groups, with village officials, Anganwadi workers, whoever I could find, basically. And this was done using the snowball method. So I didn't really conduct a census of the village and then sample it that way, but I used snowball method. But knowing what I did know about the caste composition of the village, which I will just come to, I did try to make my sample as representative as possible. So a few things about the village before I get into the caste composition. Fairly large village, 506 households. Average land size is pretty small, 5.7 acres would be about 2 hectares. And the largest land holding was only 22.5 acres. Most of the land owning households are actually marginal or small. So again, very small land holdings. The main crops are pearl millet, which is bajra, cotton, cluster bean in the Kharif season, which is the summer harvest, and wheat and mustard in the Rabi season, which is the sort of winter harvest. And most of these are green revolution crops, and I'll just come to that as well. So now to the caste breakdown of the village and my sample. So I'm using the broad distinction between Savarna and Avarna households in my work. Taking a step back, so caste we know is a system of graded inequality. These are inequalities that are inherited and historically have had a strong link with economic activity as well. So you inherit your caste and your occupation. Of course, also has a whole gamut of socio-cultural, religious, political sort of dimensions as well. So the distinction between the Savarna and Avarna would be that the Avarna is caste groups who were formerly considered as untouchable. So really at the very bottom of the caste hierarchy. The Savarna groups would be, if I had to describe in the simplest sort of manner, it would be Brahmins at the top, then Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, and Shudras. But again, this is extremely simplistic, and I would not want to sort of abide by this kind of a classification. But so broadly, you can see the Jati names here. Jati is really how caste operates on the ground. So, and there are literally thousands and thousands of Jatis, and it's not a sort of clear hierarchical system which maps sort of similarly across areas. You know, they can be really sort of unique to region. So what's interesting about this particular area is that, so for example, the upper castes in the sense of Brahmins, Rajputs, and Banyas are about 20% of the village population. And you would see that the majority of the village population is actually these other backward classes, what they're called in official classification as other backward classes, which is, and within this, the largest group is Ahirs. And then you would have the Avarna group, which is officially characterized as scheduled castes. That relates to sort of the affirmative action that these groups would get in sort of several outlets. But the Jatis that map onto scheduled castes make up about 21.8% of the village population. And what was really striking about this village was that land ownership mapped completely onto the Savarna-Avarna divide. Avarna households had almost no land. I found only one household in the entire village, one Avarna household that did own land. No other Avarna household owned land. All land was with the Savarnas. And so Avarnas are also historically the laboring castes. And indeed, to the present day, most of the local agricultural labor is indeed done by the Avarna castes. This is why I actually take up this basic divide of Savarna land owning households and Avarna landless households, because it maps so well onto the land distribution and laboring patterns of this village. And you can see that most of the land actually is with the Ahirs actually. Let me just show you. Yeah, so you would see that this dark green color represents Ahir land ownership, and you can see that most of the landless are Avarnas, and a lot of the land ownership is with the Ahirs. And yeah, so that's broadly the distribution of land ownership in this village. Now, let me describe for you the forces and relations of production very broadly. So the main forces of production in agriculture, I mean, the biggest one would be land itself, right? And most of the cultivators in my sample are owner cultivators. So there is almost no pure tenancy. There are almost no cultivators who don't own any land of their own and who are operating entirely on land that's leased in, right? So inherited land plays a big role in agriculture. Doesn't mean that tenancy doesn't exist, but it's typically on the fringes of your cultivation practice. So comparatively smaller plots of land are sort of leased in or leased out on average. in terms of the techniques of production, this area shows a near complete adoption of the Green Revolution techniques. So this started out in the 1970s with electrification, with which groundwater could be pumped with sort of electric pump sets, after which high yielding varieties of seeds got introduced, then fertilizers, and by the 90s, drought animals were also replaced almost entirely with tractors and threshers. If you look at the village today, there are several agricultural processes, big processes that are completely mechanized, and there is a very active rental market for machines. So all cultivating households don't own tractors, but some do, and they rent it out to others. They will operate the tractor themselves on another farmer's land. And so the techniques are sort of uniform across farms, pretty much irrespective of the size of the farm, which is quite interesting. I mean, I should add here that farmers are Savarna landowning households are buying seeds, fertilizers, pesticides from the market, from private shops, and then but they're selling their produce both to the government through APMC mandis and to private traders within the village. And most households are actually selling it in combination to both of these. So the market does play a extremely important role in agricultural production, but there are other forces also at play. Whether you look at the ownership of land, or you look at marketing channels, or when you look at the labor process. So now the labor process also quite diverse. Of course, locally, as I said, it is Avarna landless households who perform the vast majority of agricultural labor. This is not really tied by sort of, coercive, overtly coercive bonds anymore, in the sense that Avarna households do have freedom to choose who they want to work for, or if they don't want to work at all, which some of them do choose. However, because they are landless, and because alternative sort of employment opportunities are not that available, agricultural labor does continue to be one of the sort of big ways of earning your livelihood, particularly for Avarna women. The other big sort of type of labor process or labor employed in agriculture is migrant labor. Now, this is something that has been written about for several parts of the country for a while now. The practice that I observed in this village was that, so you would have seasonal migrants coming in from particularly Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, and Rajasthan for particularly the harvest period twice a year. And this type of labor is preferred by cultivators almost uniformly, because migrants come and work in large groups or gangs, groups ranging from sort of 15 to 25 people, comprising of men, women, and children, who would sort of all work together on 1 acre of land and harvest it or thresh it, etc. And what that means is that this kind of work is much quicker and it's much cheaper than daily wage work. So migrant labor is almost exclusively paid in piece-rated contracts. Piece-rated contracts and daily wage contracts are the two main kinds of labor contracts in this village. Obviously, cultivators prefer piece-rated contracts because it's cheaper for them, and the Avarna households prefer daily wage contracts because that's it offers a better wage rate. However, hired labor is not the entirety of labor employed in agriculture. Unpaid family labor continues to play an important role. And again, men, women, and children of the household typically engage in unpaid family labor. Though in my sample, and this is not part of this paper, but part of my next paper, what I did observe was that women in the sort of upwardly mobile landowning households tended to work less. And on average, across all landowning households as well, women contributed about 1/4 of the total farm labor. I'm not counting husbandry here. Obviously, husbandry is entirely done by women and is also severely undercounted. But so yeah, so these are the three main types of labor. And so I conducted this exercise of calculating the E ratio in order to get a sense of how much is the dependence on hired labor versus family labor. And I'm using this variant of Utsa Patnaik's E ratio, where I'm calculating it in money terms. Utsa Patnaik looks at the net labor days hired in divided by family labor days. Unfortunately, I couldn't look at net labor days hired in because, as I said, piece-rated contracts are a big part of the labor process. And piece-rated contracts can't directly be broken down into daily wage simply because they represent a lot more work for a lot less pay, right? So, I'm simply trying to calculate this in money terms to get a sense of out of the total cost of production, if we were to impute unpaid family labor time into the cost of production, how much of that would be the share of hired labor and how much of that would be the share of family labor. And essentially what I find is that for half the cultivating households, it's still family labor that dominates. And for the other half, it's hired labor that dominates. And if I were to try to look at it simply through the lens of agrarian size classes, i.e. classes based on the size of ownership of land, I would see that the smallest sort of household, the smallest landowners would have a higher E ratio, means they hire in more labor than the sort of medium landowners. Then the somewhat larger landowners would have a little bit higher E ratio, and the largest landowners would have the highest E ratio, means they're hiring in the most labor. But this is not really, this kind of a classification is not really telling us that much, because at this point I'm only looking at agricultural household, at the agricultural sort of component of household income. So instead, what I do to complement the picture that I have from agriculture, which is that it is a increasingly commercialized sort of venture, but still very much rooted in the sort of historical sort of relations and divisions of labor. I complement that picture with the diversification practices of agricultural households. And what I broadly find is that, so first off, that most landowners are actually getting the bulk of their income from non-agricultural sources. So agriculture is an increasingly small part of the total household income. And not just that, that agricultural households on average are much poorer, right? So the average per capita income of primarily agricultural households, i.e. who earn more than 50% of the total income from agri, their average per capita income is even more than half of that of diversified households. And the marginal and small landowners are in fact more likely to be diversified because it's a survival strategy, right? And that actually explains why they have a higher E ratio, because some of the family labor is now employed in non-farm work. So they need to hire in some labor to maintain their minimum level of cultivation. Most of the diversification by landowners is actually in sort of formal employment. The army is a big attractor in this part of Haryana, but also other types of government jobs are the biggest draw. And then you would have certain sort of 1/4 of the diversification is in petty business. This includes shops basically. So you could have a seed and fertilizer shop in the village, a mobile shop in a nearby town. You could have a milk product shop within the village. You could be renting out bore wells and generators to people around, things like that. So those diversification in petty businesses is about 1/4, and the rest of it is in wage work. Most of it formal and with the government, in fact, and then some of it sort of formal and informal in the private sector. And then what is this diversification actually? How is it related with agriculture? So what I observe is that surpluses from agriculture are used to set up, particularly to set up businesses. It also was kind of interesting that a lot of the businesses were in fact related with agriculture in some way. So whether it be dairy products, or it be someone who's selling seed fertilizer, or someone who's a grain merchant. So a lot of the businesses had some kind of link with agriculture. But a big part of how surplus from agriculture is mobilized is actually through education. So Savarna landowning households are much more likely to be sending their children to private schools. And private schools do cost a fair amount, particularly given the per capita income in this region. Private schools do cost, they cost about 1 lakh rupees per year in this area, in the village itself, I'm saying. So that was quite a lot. And what I saw was that about 72% of the Savarna landowning households had at least one member with a graduate degree. A lot of them also had people who had multiple sort of graduate and postgraduate degrees, etc. And what that really indicates is that you are able to use agricultural surpluses to diversify into formal employment, right? Of course, social capital also plays a role. So the fact that the army jobs are particularly, an attraction for the Ahirs, and a lot of the business was in fact done by the Banya household. So there is, concentration of Jati groups into particular types of diversification, and that probably says something, which I may not be able to parse so well because I'm not a sociologist, but at least this is what I could observe on the surface. And then so there is definitely an outflow of capital from agriculture to non-agri, right? Isn't really a lot coming back to agri from non-agri. So diversified households are actually much less likely to invest back in agriculture. In fact, primarily agricultural households, who, remember, their average per capita incomes are half of diversified households, but they were twice as likely to invest in agriculture. And by that, I mean to buy tractors or threshers, or to produce on an expanded scale, to cultivate on an expanded scale by leasing in land. So particularly the better off primarily agricultural households, i.e. if their land size was larger, or if they had some small diversifications which brought in some money income from outside, they were much more likely to invest in agriculture. And within the diversified, it's if you had an agriculture related business that you were investing back. Otherwise, households were generally not investing back. In fact, they were much more likely to be leasing out land, not all of it, but some of it. And yeah, sort of minimizing costs in agriculture rather than trying to increase returns as such. So this is sort of the spectrum of diversification that I observed in the village, going from petty business, which really, offers the most income, to public sector employment, which, comes with a job security. It used to come with pensions. Then you have sort of regular jobs in the private formal sector. You have private informal sector regular jobs, contractual employment. Then you have non-agricultural petty commodity production. So this is, someone working as a puncture repair person, or a barber, or a hawker, or things of that sort. And then you have sort of casual wage work in agriculture, in non-agriculture, and at the bottom of the barrel is really the semi-bonded type of labor, by which I mean work in brick kilns, which typically comes with an upfront payment, which is sort of a debt bondage kind of employment. And so what you would see here is that as you move down the spectrum of formality and you sort of get into the more precarious employment, it is almost entirely dominated by, or it is almost entirely left to Avarna landless households. The best jobs are obviously with the Savarna landowning households. So for the Avarna landless, obviously all households were engaged in multiple activities. I did not find a single household who was doing only agricultural labor. And that's really because agricultural labor is, I mean, there is less work available because of mechanization and because there's also migrant labor coming in that's cheaper for the cultivators. And B, because it pays so little, right? So households have to diversify. But of course, regular salaried employment is a very small chunk of that. And I mean, this relates with the fact that Avarna households are not able to, they don't have the social capital and social networks that Savarna households do. And B, they're also, because their incomes are so much lower, they're not able to invest in private education for their children. So only 18.5% of Avarna households in my sample had children going to private schools, and only about 11% had one or more graduates. Remember, Savarna households, 72% had graduates in their household. And the kind of self-employment I described already, pretty much, a lot of women working as street hawkers, seamstresses, that was one of the most sort of frequently observed occupations of women in the village, Avarna women in the village. Then you bicycle repair shop, barber shop, or these kinds of sort of, again, petty commodity production or petty self-employments. So putting these two parts of the picture together, this is the class hierarchy that I am able to distinguish, which is that you have the Savarna landowning households who are diversified in businesses, and more often than not, they have stopped putting in their own labor on the land. So they've become sort of landlords proper in that sense. They're at the top of the hierarchy, highest per capita incomes. Their labor hiring is also extremely high. Not very likely to sort of own machines, but that's because they have diversified elsewhere. Then you have the Savarna landowners who have diversified into formal employment, or who get the bulk of their income from transfers, like basically pensions. So either you have formal employment now or you had it in the past. They hire less labor in agriculture because they're able to sort of through gendered and generational divisions of labor within the household, and also sort of frequent cross so the men who have migrated out for formal jobs will come back for some time during the harvest period to contribute to the harvesting process. Those kinds of arrangements are happening. So they hire in less labor, which allows them to make more money out of the farm. And they end up having fairly sort of high per capita incomes. Again, not a lot of money coming back into agriculture for investment purposes. Then you have primarily agricultural households who do in fact make a surplus. They are not hiring a lot of labor, but they are leasing in land on a fair sort of scale, on a large scale actually, which is why they do have to hire in some labor, but they make the most money out of the farm. And then you would have Savarna landowners who are primarily agricultural but not making a surplus, or if they're diversified in informal employment, they haven't been able to crack into the good public sector jobs. These households not able to invest much, but they put in as much family labor as possible on the farm, but their per capita incomes are fairly low. At the bottom of the hierarchy, of course, are Avarna landless laboring households, do not own any land, and despite all of the multitude of economic activities, their annual per capita income is in fact less than half of what it is for the next class category. So there is clearly a big sort of gap between the Savarna and Avarna as well, even though obviously the Savarna is also this internally differentiated group. And so that brings me to my conclusion. And so the big parts of the story for me, at least, is the fact that agricultural surplus does enable Savarna landowning households to diversify into either small businesses. So this clearly the agriculture here is not productive enough that businesses, Savarna businesses are able to compete with the big businesses in the cities, right? So it's still fairly, you know, at a fairly small scale, but within the local hierarchy, it does put them in a position of great power. And the most common type of diversification is actually into formal employment, public formal employment. So that seems to be the most popular track. And there is much less evidence of money coming back into agriculture, right? So increasingly what I think is happening is that there is an urge to escape agriculture and find better opportunities. Some groups are in a position to be able to do that, right? And if they are able to, then they take up the opportunity and they keep agriculture as a fail-safe, particularly land itself as a fail-safe, which is not to be sold, which is to be kept and sort of preserved. But agriculture itself is not productive enough. So what that means is that it is extremely labor intensive. And you recognize that these other jobs are not. So one of my respondents said to me, कौन नहीं चाहता AC cooler में काम करना? Who doesn't want to work in, you know, rooms that are cooled by ACs? So land is definitely an important fallback, but the urge is to escape. Of course, that option to do it in the good jobs is only with the Savarna landowners, particularly the well-connected ones. I would categorize the landowners as petty commodity producers rather than peasants as such, because there is clearly, if it is possible to make a surplus and reinvest it, households do try to do that. If there isn't a chance to escape from agriculture, that is. So it's really happening at different levels. And of course, Avarna laboring households, they lack the social capital, they lack the fail-safe of land ownership, and therefore they're confined to really the worst jobs that are available. And I understand this entire process as Jens Lerche and Alpa Shah's conjugated oppression, which is the co-constitution of class categories with the historical social relations of oppression that exist in different places. And here what I see is caste, but also gender, and it can be other things and other places is how they would sort of describe this. So yeah, I'll stop there. Thank you so much. Yeah, over to you.
Thank you, Srishti, for that fascinating presentation. I'm going to hand over to Sakes for comments. Sakes, are you with us? Yeah, there we are. Thanks.
I'm trying to share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Not at the moment, no. It's not coming up.
I'm trying to.
So we'll give you a second. There we go. Yeah,
thanks. I'll really give a very brief reflection of our situation here in South Africa. As Alpha said, my name is Zakes. The title of my paper is A Crisis in Agrarian Relation, a Critical Race Theory of Agrarian Reforms. I'm just trying to move here. Why is it moving? Okay. I'm trying to get myself sorted. I'm sorry about that. Let me just make a few comments before I proceed. In Marx's seminal work, Capital, the subtitle of his work is a critique of political economy. And in my understanding and interpretation or analysis of that, it provides a framework of analysis which he calls historical materialism, which is a critique of the political economy, which is the commonly and dominant way of viewing agrarian reforms recently. It also puts the human being, that is us, as a human actors who actually create the conditions in which we exist. So it's nothing external or beyond us that creates the situation that we find ourselves in. And he also makes the very important point, in my view, in his work, that capital and labor are not things and entities in themselves or of their own. They have they are embedded in social relations. Marx also makes the point very clear that in labor, capital represents itself as an alien object which controls labor. Again, there's dissociation and de-link of labor and capital and the humans themselves. Now, in my point that when these social relations are concealed or confused, the solutions that we provide are usually very immaterial or inhuman in the sense that they don't enlighten the problems that you are facing and how to critically engage with this problem. And to me, this is the premise of my discussion and my paper. Now, just very briefly, in South Africa, we've got a binary agricultural system, one white and one black. That's the current situation in the country. But again, this is really a construction of many years of colonial social relations based on land dispossession, oppression, and exploitation of the black African people. So this agrarian question is based on a historical context of colonial conquest. Now, after the colonial conquest, we had what we call the settler colonial system of apartheid that we still experience today, and I'll elaborate on that. And the settler colonial system of apartheid was based really or entrenched on the Land Act of 1913 and the Land Acts of 1936, which separated the agricultural system between white-owned land and black-owned land. And the white-owned land, in most instances, or still is the most productive and most prime land of the country, was a majority of, and the bulk of the land that was held by black people, which is the 13% of the land, was really, not very prime and productive, land. Now, racial segregation and discrimination in South Africa is commonly known as apartheid, and it was built on an ideology of white supremacy, which shapes and continue to shape the reality as we experience in South Africa, particularly when we look at the land question and agrarian relations in South Africa. Now, the ideology of white supremacy balkanized the country into what was called the independent Bantu states, which were allocated for black people with very impoverished land on which they could not a living. I'm talking to the paper very quickly because of the time allocation. Now, after 1994 democratic dispensation, what has happened? Now, land as a means of production is still in the hands of white people in South Africa as I speak to you. Not much has changed insofar as it's concerned. Now, from that, we have a white class, a racial class of white owners, and a black class of landless people. So even the class question and the land question takes those racial dimensions and dynamics. Now, white land ownership in South Africa is heavily backed and forced, and supported by, capital, both domestic and external. So there's a huge, investment is still happening in the country, but it takes racial dimensions in terms of supporting and uplifting your white farmers as opposed to your black farmers. So we still have the reinforcement of those racial relations, which sometimes conflate or obfuscate the class dimension of the South African situation. Now, I call these the pre-existing or vestiges of apartheid that still continue to shape and govern the land relations in South Africa. Now, just very quickly, look at what Kamsky is saying about the hegemonic power structure, which is still here in South Africa, is prevalent. The hegemonic power structure is a form of oppression not imposed by physical force, rather than power succeeds when the dominant culture controls and subordinates parts of society to get the subordinates to become complicit in their own oppression. And that's what we're seeing after, after 1994. Though we have black people now who are in government, who are ruling, but the hegemonic structure of the agrarian relations of capital is still in the few hands of whites. And we find black people either being assimilated into this white class without actually getting a very typical African identity, or we don't see a configuration of a class within amongst the black emerging farmers. This is again a dynamic because of the hegemonic power structure that still controls and defines the relations in South Africa, and this power structure is actually still white. Now, for the discussion that I'm going to lead, I'm going to take I use an interpretive framework, which is based on the critical race theory. Now, I'm saying transformation in South Africa is embedded in pre-existing racism and endurance of the racism of apartheid within the status quo. We still see that, happening. And I'm saying a colorblind analysis of post-apartheid agrarian structures and agrarian relations manifest a reputation of pre-existing racialized injustices and inequality. So you cannot discuss and define the transformation in South Africa without looking at pre-existing exclusions that Black people are still experiencing, especially when it comes to issue of land and as a means of production. For this, I really based my thinking again on the theoretical insights of the authors as indicated here. Now I'm saying race is either a normative historical construct or is an instrument of power. And in South Africa, there is a quite clear and well-defined instrument of power and an instrument of oppression and an instrument of exploitation of the Black, landless poor. And again, even those who are trying to get entry into agriculture are still being ostracized and marginalized through apartheid systems. Now, I'm using critical race theory to demystify the condition, history, and lived realities of people who are often made invisible and silenced by pervasive of white supremacy, both by capitalism and neoliberalism. And this also goes into a lot of research that is actually happening in South Africa. We find ourselves really glossing over the issue of race when we begin to define and understand agrarian relation in this country. And to me, it's a very important issue. The conflation of class and race, which I'll get to as we go on with my discussion. Now, when I raise the issue of race here, I'm not really trying to talk about the force of gravity or whether or not race in itself is a science. I'm not in there. What I'm saying, I'm talking about the empirical evidence and existence of reality of racism in the country as it happens. Whether race or is a biological, scientific issue is not really the purpose of my discussion. But what I'm saying is that we experience as Black farmers the racism on a daily basis in the agrarian configuration that is happening in this country. Just a very brief history of what critical race theory is about. It's really to uncover institutionalized racial inequity in the legal system, which was actually used by African Americans in the USA to challenge this colorblind discourses as they were happening at that time. Again, very quickly, critical race theory argues that racism is not about individual bigotry or prejudice. It's a systematic and structural process that reproduces injustices and inequality. And again, this is the issue that we as Black farmers and landless people actually continue to experience this landlessness and poverty that happens because of poverty, poor land that we own because of the entire history that we have experienced over the years and continue to experience in one way or the other. Very quickly, the principles of the critical race theory is really to recognize that in the South African context and perhaps even beyond, that the permanence of racism is there. We have that issue of whiteness as a property where people begin to try and see how do we assimilate your Black farmers, your Black landless people into a white supremacist ideology of doing things, without trying to understand the experiences and the practices of the local people. And again, with the principles, it's a critique of liberalism. And also it looks at the issue of interest convergence and hegemonic structures, which I will get into as we go down. But most importantly, of this phase was really the narratives of people who actually experience racism on a daily basis as they try to interact on the issue of land and land reform and land redistribution in South Africa. I'm just two voices from the field because of time that actually begin to raise and highlight the issue of land and land dispossession that continues to happen in this country. I spoke to one land activist who's been in the agrarian, the forefront, who's fought in the land struggle, to get his own assessment of what is happening in the country. And in his own words, that the present government has failed to redress the apartheid past. Vestiges of racial segregation and discrimination still manifest in our society, not only but in land relations, but importantly in land relations in terms of access and ownership of land. The issue of marginalization of Black farmers still continues, especially when you look at subsistence farmers who are in the rural areas. Again, this is rooted in our history, but most important, it has eroded the identity of Black farmers, the identity of indigenous farmers in this country, who are now almost forced to emulate the dominant way of doing things. Again, this is really because of the many years of colonial rule and settler colonialism. And he argues a straight line can be drawn between what is happening in the country now than the experiences of colonialism and settler colonialism. The second person I spoke to was a woman who belongs to a cooperative, and she says she's been raised in a farming family. So are the other members of the cooperative, and they've been busy farming for over 10 years, or actually 20 years as cooperative. But then when they get support from government to support them, they more often find themselves being provided with white mentors, what she calls, white people explaining, to Black farmers how to farm when they've actually been on the land for all these years and farming for their lands for all these years on marginal land in rural areas. As she explains, she says, look, in fact, what is happening in this country, we found ourselves, though we've got Black people who are, in government, we're actually being governed by white people. Now, she puts it quite, in my view, quite succinctly. She says, what these white mentors are doing, they're trying to fix us as farmers, instead of looking at the socio and economic power structure of capitalism, which actually is what defines the level of farming and the practices of our farming. So instead of looking at us and saying, how do we help you, how do we fix you, then say, how do we fix the structures that determine the ways that we are doing in this country. Now, for this, I posit what I call a critical theory of agrarian reforms, which is founded and based on the critical race theory. And the reason for this is that I'm saying research is also a side of struggle. If we are going to engage in agrarian reforms, we also need to engage in a form of research that highlights these issues of discrimination, these issues of marginalization, almost a counter narrative to the dominant narratives that we are actually being exposed to. I'm just trying to run quickly because of time. A critical theory of agrarian reform would actually look at a methodological way of trying to say, how do we methodologically phrase the land question and the race question when we look into our research. It will look at the ontological existence of Black farmers and also the epistemological lived experiences of Black farmers, and form the basis of the agrarian discussion and discourses that are happening in this country, which to a large extent are not founded on the experiences of Black farmers, especially in the rural areas. Now the question is, what is critical about this critical, agrarian theory? Now, first is that it must acknowledge the social systems and structures that impact the realities of the landless people. That's what it should be doing. So, first, it requires scholars to consider systematic and structural forces affecting historical dispossessed and exploited communities. Second, it challenges the common narrative of deficit thinking. Now, we have deficit thinking that Black people, especially in the rural areas, are unable to farm. They don't have the necessary skills. They don't have the necessary capital. Almost when you want to enter into agriculture as a black person, you almost have this deficit that you still have to fight against, that you still have to struggle against. Again, that's because of the entrenchment of white supremacist thinking in the agricultural sector. Thirdly, it challenges the one-size-fits-all model based on colorblind narrative. Now, when you have these white men, when you have these interventions in support of Black farmers, they almost treat Black farmers and emerging Black farmers as just a homogeneous group. There is not that kind of differentiation within the analysis and understanding of the experiences and the practices of the Black farmers. And that to me is very important when you begin to deal with this issue. So you can't have a blanket and colorblind approach to this. Fourthly, it prioritizes the local values, practices, and norms. It should be embedded in the day-to-day experiences of the farmers themselves, instead of bringing imposition from outside to define and determine the way in which Black people relate to their land, relate to the ways in which they utilize the land to feed themselves, to feed their families, and to build themselves as a people. That's very important. It's very critical about these issues. Again, the important issue about the issue is that intersectionality is a very important framework when you begin to look at how do we address the agrarian question in South Africa. You have to look at the issue of race. We have to look at of class. We have to look at the issue of gender. All these issues are embedded in the struggles for transformation. That to me is very important. Again, that we need to look at it. And very quickly, the issue of interest convergence. Basically, the issue of interest convergence is origin in Marxist theory, that the bourgeois will always allow progress for the proletariat only if this progress profit the bourgeois even more. So that's again, when we talk about change and transformation, land redistribution, what the capital is saying, well, what is your contribution in the terms of economic growth? Now we say you can't use economic growth as the only measure of land and agrarian relation. Essentially, what land is about is a political question in South Africa. You cannot only address it at the economic level, but also you have to address it at the political level. Now, basically, Herren Falcon, a democracy, which is actually, a vestige of apartheid. Again, the name becomes very clear on this on these issues. Now, when Engels talk about the peasant question, he talks of it in the wider context of understanding the peasant question within the capitalist frame of reference or in the capitalist mode of production. Then it comes the question of a peasant as a class and its role in terms of a transformation in South Africa. And again, that is very important. Again, this just from my past experience as part of the landless people's movement, this issue came very much to the fore when we talked and engaged with other sectors of society on the issue of land and the issue of class formation in South Africa. White supremacy and privilege. Now, again, the issue of white supremacy thinking and white supremacists in South Africa as a privilege in itself. When you're a white person who's involved in agriculture, you're involved in productive agriculture, and very important again, it's not only the land that they own that is important, but they own the entire agricultural value chain. So even as a black person, you want to enter, you've got so many other loops that you've got to jump before you can even get or gain the necessary recognition as a farmer. Again, this recognition is based on this privilege and white supremacist thinking that's actually being enjoyed by the white farmers for many years and continue to enjoy. Now, again, this is a concept which I call separate togetherness, that there's a tendency to try to forge a kind of a class alliance between the black farmers and the white farmers. But even when that is happening, as we call it, separate togetherness, yes, they are separate in terms of being in the same sector, but in terms of access to land, access to resources, there's a huge, discrepancy. You still find that what call it white farmers identifying as white farmers as and above farmers themselves. There's a lot of structures and unions in South Africa that represent white interest. And so Kona says that race is, in this case, is conceptualized by means of two major lenses. Race is a variable and race as a culture. And we see that happening in South Africa. Racism is entrenched in agrarian relation and agrarian structures by corporate interests to maintain dominance over disadvantaged society. That's how most black farmers actually continue to be subjected and subjugated because of this dominance that that these white farmers have. So it's no existential coincidence land and race some of the catalog of reparation and restoration discourses, while justice and equality are relentlessly pursued here. So again, when we talk about race, we cannot separate it from the issue of land access, ownership, and control, especially of the control of productive land. Okay, institutional exclusion now. Vestiges of systematic institutionalism continue to harm generations of black farmers and poor rural communities that face rooted institutional and economic barriers, mainly access to productive resources like land, water, and investment. Black farmers assert that race is still a major issue in the experiences, saying that class alone does not explain the exclusion. It's argued by Young, transformation transpire as much more than disconnected acts of random reform. Policy intervention must address the basic epistemological and the philosophical assumptions that inform their practices. And I don't see this happening as in South Africa, especially when we look at the issue of class and the issue of land. Now, very briefly, issue of racism and class. Exploring racism in agrarian reform is complex. It's compounded by lack of theoretical agrarian concept and analytical tools to sustain empirical narratives on racism. As Marx explained, class antagonism found within capitalism, this is misspelled there. Okay. Lenin viewed race as a primary source of empowering divisions within the international working class. I think there was a typo there. But yeah, Lenin said viewed race as a primary source of empowering divisions within the international working class. It really continues, to muddy the waters when you talk class, allegiance and class alignment in South Africa. The issue of race really keeps on emerging and popping up in our discussion. But again, in my view, that the issue of theory and practice becomes very important in terms of how do we then, theorize the issue of race? How do we then find practical ways of engaging with it and trying to forge and form an alliance that would actually help us to transform? Okay, in conclusion, a critical race theory and agrarian reform perspective is rooted within the lived experience, knowledge systems, practices, norms, and values of the landless and poor people. It is critical of studies that favor neoliberal and minimal states which are hostile to the environment and humankind. Marx says the idea of philosophers is not only to understand, interpret the world, but the idea really is for us to see how do we change the world. And the critical race theory and agrarian reform is looking precisely at that, not only trying to understand the difficulties and the hardships that are experienced by poor landless South Africans, but say, how do we change the environment? How do we change the agrarian relations in South Africa? As we say in Zulu, ngiyabonga, siyabonga. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Sakes. That certainly put a lot on the table. We are running a bit short on time, so I'm wondering if it's all right with Srishti if we should go straight to questions, basically. Is that okay? Yeah. All right, guys, participants, you can put up your hand or you can put your question in the chat box, whichever suits you. I know I have a question for Srishti, but I'm going to hold back a little bit. before I abuse my powers as the chair of the session. So, any questions? I think, yeah, Trent's there. Trent, come on in.
Hi, thanks, Srishti. First of all, I think it's a really excellent study. It sort of reminds me a lot of some of the best research on agrarian class composition from the 70s and 80s, the kind of research that I wish there was a bit more of today. I was sort of interested in how representative you think that this village was of conditions across Haryana. And the reason why I ask is my experience doing research in Punjab is that while most villages have the kind of caste-based land distribution that you describe here, I have been to villages where scheduled caste households own a much larger share of land, perhaps even a majority of the land. And those are places where SC families had been recipients of land as part of land redistribution policies back in the mid-20th century. So I guess my question is like whether you have a feeling for, if you were able to take a sample of multiple villages across southern Haryana, do you suspect you'd have more or less the same picture as from your sample village, or perhaps it would be a little different? And then another very quick question is the categories that you use of Savarna and Avarna, are they organic and vernacular terms that are used in everyday life, or is this sort of just a convenient term that you use to split off scheduled caste people from everybody else? So thanks.
Alf, can I answer or should I take more questions?
Yeah, no, go for it.
Okay, Trent, thank you so much for both of those questions, really sort of important. So how representative is it of southern Haryana? I would say very. I haven't really come across villages in southern Haryana where Dalits own any substantial land. And in fact, my guess is that this is kind of true for the entire Green Revolution region. I don't see this as a region where Dalits really own land. Yeah. So, and in terms of the use of Savarna and Avarna, whether they are vernacular, no, they are not. These are not words that you would hear on the ground. On the ground, that the words that you would hear would be jati names themselves, rather than this kind of a big characterization that I've tried to do. So yeah. I completely understand that, I am bringing in a categorization from above, which, and I've had some distance from this work now, so I can also understand the limitations of using the category of Savarna in the first place, because there definitely are some smaller OBC groups who are not as dominant as the Ahirs are. So yeah, definitely like lots to think about in this realm.
Thanks, Srishti. Are there any other questions that people want to raise? Grace has her hand up.
Hi, Srishti, that was also, I want to echo what Trent said. I really enjoyed your presentation. I think it's great to see studies like this, and I particularly enjoyed actually the way you did forefront caste. I think it's great to see that being really brought up in that way. And I just really had some questions about land, and I think it's land means so many different things to different people, and the story that you tell of some of the kind of better off landowners holding on to land, keeping land, but not necessarily continuing to invest in it, I think is something that I've seen in research in Tamil Nadu, where there's the whole garment industry that people are investing in. But I wondered also if you're if there's a story about real estate as well, and land changing in that way, because we're seeing a picture where real estate is something that a lot of people are investing in, and land is changing from being agricultural to being, divided up into real estate. And it was really just a question: is there also the shift in that way? Because another thing that it struck me when I was basically asking you sort of very similar questions to what you've been asking to a very rich, or someone I knew as a very good agriculturalist who invested a lot in agriculture. And I asked him, is agriculture still your main source of income? And actually he started talking about the land that he owns on the edge of a town, which he rents out and has a shop on, and how much income he was getting from that. And I thought, okay, it's kind of invisible, but it's really, really important in terms of his income sources. So I wondered about land and real estate and rental income and that sort of thing. Thank you.
Yeah, that's Grace, thank you so much for that question. I mean, so I didn't observe this as much. The renting out of land for non-agricultural purposes, it's there, but it seems that even the richer sort of households want to continue to maintain some relation with the land, maybe not directly, but leasing it out to their brother or someone in the extended family, something like that. There seems to be some apprehension to letting go of land completely, even in the renting sort of scenario. So, but there is instances of them using the surplus to buy land in more prime locations and then renting those out, right? Or just like simply buying it for speculation purposes. So there does seem to be some separation of, ancestral land and other land. And that actually came up a lot, as people mentioned that they don't want to sell it because this is the Bap Dada ki, fathers and forefathers land and things like that. So, and that makes you think about where this class structure is going for sure, because it doesn't seem that people will start seeing this as unviable and therefore give it up. So, yeah, that raises several questions as well.
Thank you. Anyone else? If not, then I shall. I have a question I'd like to ask. Srishti, when I read your article when it came out and reread it before the seminar, I started thinking about your use of the term conjugated oppression, which I think works very well, and it also really resonates with a lot of the dynamics that I found myself in sort of studying agrarian dynamics in Madhya Pradesh, basically. So not all that far from where you've been working. Now, what I'm interested in is in a sense the relationship between that structure of conjugated oppression that your work illustrates so well, and the level of politics, if you will. What this sort of pushes towards is, of course, a discussion of how we understand agrarian politics, contemporary agrarian politics. If we go back to the 1990s and the discussion about new farmers movements and so on and so forth, there was a very significant criticism there of how the new farmers movements sort of narrative of resistance papered over precisely the dynamics that you expose through this brilliant work. And I think those were very valid criticisms. We've just had, in sort of from November 2020 to November 21, a re-emergence of quite potent farmers' protests and farmers' struggles. There were those who argued that things have changed quite significantly, in terms of class dynamics internally in these movements. And I suppose I'm wondering how you read the workings of the structure, the kind of structures that you sort of that you lay bare with your work in terms of or in relation to these protests, at the same time as both 2014 and 2019 have witnessed a strong ruralization of the BJP vote, and which has happened in parallel with a sort of subalternization of that vote, by which I mean that, what was traditionally a sort of upper class, middle class, mainly urban party has extended its reach massively into the countryside and also downwards into the social hierarchy, if you will, of Indian society. I don't know if that quite makes sense, but that is the question I've been mulling over for the past couple of days.
Thank you, Alf, for that monster of a question.
Yeah.
Let me answer it as best I can. So my reading is that the kinds of contradictions that were raised at the New Farmers Movement time are, to some extent, some of those questions were raised this time as well, right? In the sense that this time I think there was a lot more effort to develop or to show a unity between cultivating and laboring classes. Whether that unity exists, I don't in an area like this, it is a very, very contested unity. I don't know if that, so it might exist in some places, but I could not see it here. And in fact, what I see is this fundamental contradiction between the laboring and the cultivating. You're not even cultivating, the idea that the cultivating is also the erstwhile feudal, overlord, and is also the one who's able to take advantage of the formal new economy, and so in that sense, and the second element of the story is that I think that increasingly sort of agrarian politics itself is also changing, because dependence on agriculture is changing. And so there will be some parts of the country where cultivators are heavily invested in what's happening to agriculture, and other parts where they might not be as invested in it anymore, because pathways outside are much more important. And so that's the other dimension of the story. The third dimension is how many of these pathways are available to you in exactly where you are. If there are a lot of pathways, then or if there are not that many pathways, then the laboring classes might also be somewhat invested in this kind of a political struggle, which is seeking to maintain the sort of existing structure of state support, basically. Because, but yeah, this is where I see the kind of farmer laborer unity as an aspirational identity, really, that people are trying to work towards, but I don't know what it means in the material. I don't know what it means for everyday production practices. So that's one part of my response. The second big part of your question had to do with the BJP itself and its voter base. And there it does seem that, so because the politics of this area is so heavily dominated by the upper caste, by the Ahirs, in fact, not even any other upper caste, but the Ahirs themselves. So definitely there is a tendency for Avarna groups to veer towards the BJP, and which is also how the BJP came into power to a large extent in this area as well. But there is resentment towards unfulfilled promises, and the recognition of a lack of alternative. So a force like BSP is not so strong in this part of Haryana, right? But but I could see some kind of sort of resonance with a Dalit identity, which is distinct from everyone else, and which has power to, so what I was told was, we have the power to withhold our vote if we have nothing else. So, there is something happening. It will definitely take time to fructify, and we will see where it goes. Yeah, I'm going to leave it at that. I would actually love to hear your insights on this as well.
Yeah, no, I think it's a question that many of us who sort of study India and work on India struggle to find adequate answers to, because it's terribly complicated. Also, of course, in the sense that what we've seen after that great conflagration, that great sort of upsurge of a farmer struggle in 2020 and into 2021, or throughout the entire year, is that it comes alongside, if you will, the continued strength of the ruling party in regions that are, if not Haryana, but at least very similar to Haryana. I'm thinking of Western UP, where you have a BJP minister's son who literally drives his car over protesting farmers, and in that state, the BJP chief minister is returned to power in a big way after a campaign that was mostly sort of based on a strongly Islamophobic sort of Hindu national and therefore also Hindu nationalist message. So it's a confounding scenario. So I think a lot more thinking needs to go into that, and I think it raises. I think it points to the challenges of formulating politics and building political movements in scenarios of conjugated oppression, where class comes together with other structures of power. In your case, in your case, caste, or in the Indian case, caste, in the South African case, as Segs talked about, the way in which class and race are intertwined. So yeah, I think it testifies, it really is testimony to how complex political questions become in lieu of or in the context of those kind of structures. So there's lots more there for us to talk about, moving forward, I think. We have about 3 minutes or so. I don't know if anyone wants to propose a last question to the presentation or add to the discussion. Okay, I think then it remains to thank Srishti, first of all, for her presentation. I've been looking forward to this, as I am such a big fan of this paper and of your work. So thank you very much for joining us. I hope it's just the first conversation in a long series of several conversations. Thanks also to Segs for bringing in South African context in such an insightful and incisive manner. And to everyone who joined us today. Thanks, guys. I hope to see you all soon again. There are more webinars coming up, so do keep an eye out. All right. Thank you.
Thanks, Al.